Dexter Kane stepped onto his front porch expecting to see 50 acres of green pasture stretching toward the horizon. Instead, he stared at a moonscape of churned earth, scattered fence posts, and tire tracks carved deep into what had been his family's land for 3 generations. The single oak tree he had planted 3 weeks ago stood untouched in the center of the devastation, like a monument in a graveyard. He had planted it in the exact spot where his father used to sit every evening, watching the sunset over land that had been Kane property since 1962, the same spot where Thomas Kane had spent his final lucid moments, making Dexter promise to never sell the family land, no matter what anyone offered. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers and shattered on the wooden planks. This was impossible. Yesterday at sunset, everything had been perfect. Now his entire world looked like a construction zone. But there was no construction, just destruction. And somehow, according to the official notice stapled to his gate, it was all completely legal. The morning air carried the scent of diesel fuel and disturbed earth. Dexter's hands shook as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed his neighbor, Frank Martinez, who owned the adjacent property. The phone rang 4 times before Frank's gravelly voice answered. "Frank, did you see anything last night? Hear any machinery?" "What machinery, Dex? You building something over there?" Dexter's stomach dropped. Frank's bedroom window faced directly toward the Kane property. If heavy equipment had worked through the night, Frank would have heard it, unless Frank was lying, or unless something else entirely had happened. Walking through the destruction, Dexter found tire tracks from at least 6 different vehicles: bulldozers, excavators, dump trucks. The tracks were fresh, maybe 6 hours old. His pasture gate hung open, the chain cut clean through with industrial bolt cutters. Professional work. This wasn't vandalism by teenagers or a neighbor dispute. This was organized, methodical, expensive. Near the oak tree, he discovered a bright orange notice stapled to a temporary fence post. The letterhead read, Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association, Legal Compliance Division. The notice was dated 2 weeks ago, addressed to property owner, 4847 Ranch Road, and signed by someone named Victoria Sterling, president. The document cited 17 different violations of community environmental safety standards, including unauthorized tree placement creating potential soil contamination hazard, failure to obtain environmental impact assessment for suspected underground fuel storage area, and non-compliance with watershed protection protocols. At the bottom, in bold red letters, it stated, Court-ordered emergency remediation completed per injunction Thavrisar 2024-1156, environmental health emergency. Property owner responsible for all associated costs, $47,000. Dexter read the notice 3 times, his hands trembling. Environmental emergency due to suspected fuel contamination. The legal language was designed to make his memorial oak sound like it had been planted over a toxic waste site. Yet somehow a judge had been convinced that a single tree posed such an immediate threat to groundwater that it justified destroying 50 acres overnight. The oak represented more than memory. His father had taught him that oak trees lived for centuries, their roots growing deeper than any other species. When you plant an oak, you're not just planting for yourself, Thomas Kane had said during one of their evening conversations. You're planting for your children and their children. The tree was meant to honor that legacy. Rooted in the same soil where his grandfather had built their first barn in 1962, where his father had proposed to his mother in 1978, where 3 generations of Kanes had made their living from the land. Now that symbol of permanence stood alone in a field of destruction, and Victoria Sterling, whoever she was, had used it as justification to erase everything else his family had built. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had left the tree standing, and as long as it survived, Dexter had something worth fighting for. He pulled out his phone to call his attorney, but as he scrolled through his contacts, a black SUV with tinted windows turned into his driveway. The license plate frame read, Sterling Legal Services. The enemy was coming to collect. Victoria Sterling stepped out of the SUV with the calculated precision of someone who had done this before. She stood about 5'7" with shoulder-length blonde hair pulled back professionally, and cold blue eyes that suggested corporate efficiency. Her charcoal business suit was expensive but practical, designed for intimidation rather than fashion. Everything about her suggested ruthless competence. But Dexter caught something else in her expression when she looked at his property. Recognition, like she was seeing something that had personal meaning beyond business. Mr. Kane, I presume? Her voice carried the authority of someone who rarely heard the word no. I'm Victoria Sterling, president of the Sunset Ridge Environmental Protection Association. I trust you received our emergency compliance notice. Dexter stepped closer, his anger finally overtaking his shock. Lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but my family has owned this land since before you were born. No association, environmental or otherwise, has any authority here. Victoria opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency. Actually, Mr. Kane, federal environmental regulations supersede local property rights when public safety is involved. As of 6 months ago, when the EPA classified this watershed as environmentally sensitive, all tree plantings within the protected zone require environmental impact studies. Environmental impact studies for one oak tree? Dexter's voice carried the kind of incredulous anger that comes from watching your world get turned upside down by bureaucratic insanity. Oak trees planted near groundwater sources can disrupt aquifer flow patterns. Your tree was positioned directly over the main water supply line for the proposed Sunset Ridge development. Victoria handed him a thick folder. The emergency injunction was necessary to prevent contamination of drinking water for 3,000 future residents. Dexter stared at the documentation, recognizing the sophisticated legal manipulation, but unable to find obvious flaws in the paperwork. This is all fabricated. There is no water supply line here, no development, no 3,000 residents. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, revealing something underneath the corporate facade. Mr. Kane, development projects require years of advanced planning. Property acquisition must be completed before construction can begin. We're simply ensuring environmental compliance during the transition period. Whose transition period? Who hired you to steal family land? Dexter's direct confrontation seemed to catch Victoria off guard. I represent legitimate business interests who understand the economic potential of this area better than... Victoria paused, her mask slipping for just a moment. Better than families who can't see beyond sentiment. The word sentiment carried a bitter edge, as if Victoria had personal experience with the conflict between business and family attachments. Dexter filed that observation away. Everyone had vulnerabilities, even corporate predators in expensive suits. The cost of environmental remediation was $47,000, Sterling continued, her professional demeanor restored. Payment is due within 30 days, or my company will be forced to acquire the property to satisfy the court judgment. And if I can't pay? Though Dexter already knew the answer, he wanted to hear her say it. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and for the first time, Dexter saw genuine concern flash across her face before she composed herself. Then we'll purchase your property to satisfy the judgment. Sterling Development Group resolves these situations fairly and efficiently. What about my neighbors? Are you planning to resolve their situations too? Mr. Kane, this conversation is about your property and your violations. I suggest you focus on your own compliance issues. Victoria's tone had become sharper, more defensive. The text message had clearly rattled her. Dexter made a calculated decision to push harder. How many other families have you destroyed with fake environmental emergencies? How many judges are on your payroll? Victoria's eyes flashed with anger, and her mask slipped completely. Mr. Kane, you have no idea what you're interfering with. There are people who invested serious money in this project, and they expect results. I would hate for you to become an obstacle that requires more direct resolution. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Victoria Sterling wasn't just targeting him. She was systematically going after rural property owners, using bureaucratic weapons to force them into financial ruin. What if I can't pay? Dexter asked. Victoria's smile widened, showing teeth like porcelain knives. Then we'll be happy to purchase your property at fair market value. Sterling Development Group specializes in distressed rural acquisitions. She climbed back into her SUV, leaving Dexter standing in his destroyed pasture, holding a $47,000 bill for the privilege of having his life demolished. As the black vehicle disappeared down Ranch Road, he realized this wasn't about tree placement or community standards. This was about stealing his land, and Victoria Sterling had just declared war on the wrong rancher. Dexter spent the rest of the morning at the county courthouse, but this time he wasn't just looking for documents. He was hunting for connections, following paper trails like his father had taught him to track animals through the woods. The clerk, Janet, had worked there for 15 years and knew where the real information was buried. Something about Sterling bothered me from the first time she showed up here. Janet whispered, as they dug through basement archives. She knew exactly which documents she needed, like she'd studied our filing system for months. And she always came alone, never with other property owners like she claimed to represent. What Dexter found made his blood boil. Sterling had been researching his family specifically. The courthouse database showed multiple searches for Kane property records dating back 8 months, well before his father's death. She had been studying his family's land ownership, tax records, and even his father's medical bills, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The association was incorporated 3 days after his father's obituary appeared in the Herald Tribune. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was predatory calculation designed to exploit a grieving son's vulnerability. Look at this. Janet pointed to a series of documents stapled together. She filed preliminary environmental impact papers 2 months before your father died, claiming potential groundwater contamination in your area. She was building the legal trap while your father was in hospice care. Dexter photocopied everything, stuffing the papers into a manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Back at his truck, he called his attorney, Bill Hendricks, who had handled his father's estate. Bill listened quietly as Dexter explained the situation, occasionally muttering things like, "That's not how zoning works," and "HOAs can't just claim random properties." "Dexter, what you're describing is impossible under Texas law. HOAs are tied to specific subdivisions with recorded covenants. You can't just declare someone's ranch is now part of your association because you filed some paperwork. We need to meet. Can you be at my office in an hour?" Instead of waiting for Sterling to call him, Dexter decided to call her first. When she answered, he could hear tension in her voice that hadn't been there during their face-to-face meeting. "Miss Sterling, this is Dexter Kane. I've been doing some research of my own today." A pause. "Mr. Kane, I hope you're calling to discuss payment arrangements for your compliance debt. Actually, I'm calling to discuss your research into my family's property records dating back 8 months. Interesting timing, considering my father wasn't diagnosed with terminal cancer until 7 months ago." The silence stretched longer than she probably intended. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new edge. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but environmental assessments require historical research. Historical research that included my father's medical records?" Dexter was bluffing, but her sharp intake of breath told him he'd hit something. "Mr. Kane, you're making serious accusations without evidence. I'd be very careful about spreading unfounded theories about legitimate business operations. And if I refuse to sell?" Victoria's pause was calculated, designed for maximum impact. "Well, Mr. Kane, our Architectural Review Board continues to identify additional compliance violations. Your barn needs updating, your fence line appears to encroach on setback requirements, and your well house doesn't meet current safety standards. The accumulated fines could reach 6 figures very quickly." The line went dead. Dexter pulled into Bill Hendricks' parking lot, feeling like he was walking into the fight of his life. But at least now he understood the true scope of what he was facing. Sterling wasn't running an environmental protection association. She was running a sophisticated extortion operation, using bureaucratic weapons and inside information to force rural families off properties they'd owned for generations. The question was how many other people were trapped in her web, and whether anyone had the courage to fight back before she destroyed everything they held sacred. Bill Hendricks's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building that had been downtown since before Dexter was born. The attorney was 62 years old, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a college professor. He studied Dexter's photocopied documents with the focused attention of a surgeon examining X-rays. "This is systematic fraud," Bill said finally. "Victoria Sterling has created a fake HOA, corrupted county officials to approve illegal zoning changes, and is using manufactured violations to extort property owners. But she's been very careful about the legal framework. Every document appears legitimate on the surface. So what do? We need evidence of the corruption, and we need it fast. She's clearly targeting properties for specific reasons." Bill leaned back in his leather chair. "We also need media attention. Judges hate public scrutiny when they're involved in questionable rulings." As if summoned by the conversation, Bill's secretary knocked on the door. "There's a reporter here to see Mr. Kane. Says she's been investigating property fraud in rural areas." Maya Chen entered Bill's office with the controlled energy of someone who had been living on caffeine and determination for months. She was in her early 30s with shoulder-length black hair and dark brown eyes that held both intelligence and barely contained anger. Her athletic build and firm handshake suggested someone who had learned to fight for what she believed in. "Mr. Kane, I'm Maya Chen from the Herald Tribune. I've been investigating Sterling's operation since she tried to steal my grandfather's farm in Jefferson County. What she did to your property represents an escalation in her tactics that I've never seen before." The personal connection surprised Dexter. This wasn't just professional curiosity for Maya. This was revenge. "Your grandfather?" Bill leaned forward. 87 years old, farmed the same land for 60 years. Victoria Sterling's people showed up with fake environmental violations 3 months after my grandmother died. Said his property posed a contamination risk to a development that didn't exist. Maya's voice carried controlled fury. He had a heart attack trying to fight their lawsuit. Died believing he'd failed to protect the family land. Dexter glanced at Bill, who nodded. For the next 20 minutes, Dexter recounted everything that had happened, from planting the memorial oak to Victoria Sterling's threats. Maya took notes rapidly, occasionally asking for clarification about dates and amounts. "You mentioned other properties being targeted," Maya said. "I've found records of forced sales on 12 rural properties in this county over the past 4 months, all purchased by Sterling Development Group at significantly below market value, all preceded by HOA violations." Bill leaned forward. 12 properties? That's not harassment. That's a systematic operation. Dexter felt an unexpected connection to Maya's anger, recognizing the same protective fury he felt about his own family's land. "I'm sorry about your grandfather, but why are you risking your career to investigate this?" Maya's eyes met his, and something passed between them that went beyond professional collaboration. "Because Victoria Sterling destroys families, and someone needs to stop her. My editor thinks I'm obsessed. Maybe he's right, but I've seen what she does to people like us, people who believe land is more than just real estate." The way Maya said "people like us" carried weight beyond her words. Dexter realized she understood something about family legacy that most people didn't, especially people who grew up in cities where land was just another commodity to be bought and sold. "There's something else you need to know," Maya continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Sterling isn't just targeting random rural properties. She specifically hunts families dealing with grief, medical bills, or financial stress. She studies obituaries, hospital records, divorce filings. She feeds on vulnerability." Bill leaned back in his chair. "That's sociopathic. It's predatory capitalism disguised as environmental protection," Maya replied. "And Mr. Kane, based on what happened to the 2 other property owners who fought back, I don't think she stops at legal intimidation when people refuse to cooperate." Maya's plan was dangerous, but simple. She would pose as a potential land seller while Dexter gathered evidence from the inside. That evening, she called Sterling's office using a burner phone, claiming to own 70 acres in the next county over and facing financial difficulties after her husband's recent death. Sterling agreed to meet the next morning. Dexter spent the night installing hidden cameras around his property, borrowed from his neighbor Frank Martinez, who worked security for a local bank. The cameras were motion-activated and transmitted wirelessly to Dexter's laptop. If Sterling's people returned to finish what they started, he would have proof. At dawn, he positioned himself in the tree line overlooking Sterling's office building in town. Maya had given him a small recording device that could pick up conversations through windows if he got close enough. The plan felt like something from a spy movie, but the destroyed pasture behind him reminded him this was deadly serious. Sterling arrived at 7:30 sharp, driving the same black SUV, but she wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the passenger seat, someone Dexter had never seen before. The stranger looked like money, the kind of person who expected results and didn't ask questions about methods. Through the recording device, Dexter heard fragments of their conversation as they approached the building. "The Kane property needs to be resolved quickly," the stranger was saying. "Our timeline has moved up. The highway extension announcement comes next month." Highway extension. Maya had been right about the inside information. Someone was feeding Sterling details about government infrastructure projects before they became public knowledge. At 10 o'clock, Maya arrived for her appointment, playing the role of a grieving widow perfectly. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the kind of defeated posture that predators like Sterling would find irresistible. Dexter watched through binoculars as she entered the building. 45 minutes later, Maya emerged looking shaken but successful. She had recorded the entire meeting on her phone. Sterling had offered to buy her fictional property for 30% below market value, citing urgent environmental compliance issues that would cost hundreds of thousands to resolve. But Maya had also learned something crucial. Sterling was working under pressure from major investors who had already committed millions to the development project. The Kane property was the final piece they needed, and delay wasn't acceptable. "She's scared," Maya told Dexter when they met at a diner outside town. "Someone is pushing her hard." She mentioned having to report to people who don't tolerate setbacks. Maya played the recording on her phone. Sterling's voice was different during the meeting, more desperate than the cold confidence she had displayed at Dexter's property. "We can fast-track the environmental assessment, but you need to sign today. My partners are very particular about deadlines." Dexter leaned across the table, studying Maya's face in the afternoon light filtering through the diner windows. Somewhere between the investigation and the shared danger, his feelings had shifted from professional alliance to something more personal. Maya must have noticed because she reached across and placed her hand on his. "Dexter, we're getting close. But Sterling knows we're investigating her. The SUV following us proves that." She was right. The same black vehicle had been visible in his rearview mirror during the drive to the diner. "Whatever we do next, we have to be smart about it." Before Dexter could respond, his phone buzzed with an alert from the motion-activated cameras. Someone was at his property, in broad daylight, and they weren't trying to hide. Dexter's laptop screen showed two figures in dark clothing walking directly toward his memorial oak tree. One carried what looked like a chainsaw. The other held a container that could be gasoline or herbicide. They were here to finish what Sterling had started, to eliminate the last symbol of his father's legacy. "Maya, I have to go. They're trying to destroy the tree." Dexter, "No. That's exactly what they want. You show up alone, something happens to you, and Sterling gets your property anyway." Maya grabbed his arm, but he was already standing. "That tree is all I have left of my father. I won't let them take it." The 15-minute drive back to his property felt like an hour. Dexter called Bill Hendricks on the way, telling him to contact the sheriff if he didn't hear back within 30 minutes. Then he called Frank Martinez, asking him to bring his hunting rifle and meet at the property line. When Dexter arrived, the two men had the chainsaw running and were making preliminary cuts into the oak's bark. The tree was bleeding sap like tears, but it was still standing. Dexter parked his truck between them and their escape route, then stepped out with his own rifle visible across his chest. "That's far enough," he shouted over the chainsaw's noise. The men shut off the saw. The larger one, wearing a ski mask despite the Texas heat, spoke with a calm voice that suggested this wasn't his first intimidation job. "Mr. Kane, you need to walk away. This tree represents a violation of court orders. We're here to complete the remediation process." "At gunpoint? For our protection." Property disputes can get emotional. The man's partner opened the container he'd been carrying. The smell of industrial herbicide drifted across the pasture. "This will be quick and painless. Much easier than what happens if you keep causing problems for our employer." Dexter heard Frank's truck approaching from the north. His neighbor had brought backup as promised. But before Frank could arrive, Maya's car appeared from the south, driving too fast down the dirt road. She parked behind Dexter's truck and emerged with her phone recording everything. "Gentlemen, this is Maya Chen from the Herald Tribune. I'm documenting this encounter for tomorrow's front page story about corporate intimidation tactics in rural Texas." The masked men exchanged glances. Publicity was obviously not part of their instructions. The larger one spoke into a radio clipped to his collar. "Control, we have media on site, requesting guidance." A voice crackled back through the radio static. "Abort. Return to base immediately." "But the tree." "I said abort. Now." The men packed their equipment quickly and headed toward a black pickup truck parked behind the tree line. As they drove away, the license plate was clearly visible on Maya's phone recording. Frank arrived moments later with his rifle and two other neighbors who had heard about the confrontation. Word was spreading through the rural community that the Kane property was under siege. "Dexter, you can't stay here tonight," Maya said, reviewing the footage she had captured. "Those men weren't contractors. They were professional intimidators. Sterling is escalating to violence. I'm not leaving my land. Then I'm staying with you." The words came out before Maya seemed to realize she had said them. "Someone needs to witness whatever they try next." Frank nodded approvingly. "We'll set up a rotation. Armed neighbors watching the property 24 hours. Let's see Sterling try to bulldoze this place with half the county standing guard." As the sun set over the damaged pasture, Dexter realized the fight had shifted. Sterling had made a crucial mistake by threatening him with violence in front of witnesses. Now the entire rural community was invested in protecting not just his property, but the principle that family land couldn't be stolen through bureaucratic terrorism. But Maya's phone was buzzing with text messages that made her face pale. Sterling had one more card to play, and it was bigger than either of them had imagined. Maya's text messages contained photos that made her hands shake. Someone had taken pictures of her apartment, her car, her elderly mother's house in Dallas. The final message was simple: stop the investigation, or people you care about will suffer accidents. They found my family, Maya whispered. Maya, showing Dexter the images. Sterling knows I won't sacrifice my mother for a story. But Frank Martinez had been listening to the radio chatter between the masked men earlier, and his security experience had paid off. Those frequencies are monitored by the FBI. Industrial intimidation across state lines falls under federal jurisdiction. I already made the call. Within 2 hours, 3 black SUVs with federal plates arrived at Dexter's property. Special Agent Sarah Rodriguez introduced herself as the lead investigator for a federal task force already tracking Sterling's operation across multiple states. Ms. Chen, your grandfather's case in Jefferson County was one of 12 similar frauds we've been investigating. Mr. Kane's property represents the largest attempted theft yet, and the first time they've escalated to armed intimidation. Agent Rodriguez reviewed Maya's recordings on her tablet. We've been building a federal case for months, but we needed direct evidence of violent crimes to obtain arrest warrants. This footage gives us everything we need for immediate federal charges. The FBI had been tracking Sterling's financial transactions, communications with corrupt county officials, and connections to organized real estate fraud, but constitutional protections had prevented them from making arrests based purely on financial crimes. Dexter's Memorial Oak had inadvertently triggered the escalation they needed to move from investigation to prosecution. Victoria Sterling isn't her real name, Rodriguez explained. She's Veronica Steinberg, wanted in 3 states for similar schemes. Her operation has stolen over $40 million in rural property using fake environmental agencies. What's interesting is that she grew up on a farm in Oklahoma that was lost to corporate foreclosure when she was 16. She's been systematically targeting the same kind of families that destroyed her childhood. The revelation added a disturbing psychological dimension to Sterling's crimes. She wasn't just motivated by greed. She was taking revenge against rural families for the trauma she had experienced decades earlier, using their own vulnerability against them in a twisted cycle of inherited pain. While the FBI coordinated with local law enforcement, Dexter received a call from Judge Morrison, the same judge who had signed the original injunction against his property. The judge's voice was shaky and defensive. Mr. Kane, I need to inform you that new evidence has come to light regarding the environmental assessment of your property. The original injunction was based on fraudulent documentation. I'm issuing an immediate reversal of all previous orders. The judge had clearly been contacted by federal authorities. The fraudulent environmental emergency was officially canceled. The $47,000 debt was declared null and void, and Dexter's property rights were fully restored. But Sterling wasn't finished. As FBI agents prepared to arrest her at her office, she made one final desperate move. Using explosives her security team had prepared as backup, she attempted to destroy the courthouse records that contained evidence of her corruption. The blast shattered windows throughout downtown, but failed to destroy the evidence. Digital backups and Maya's investigative files had already been secured by the FBI. Sterling's desperation had only added federal terrorism charges to her growing list of crimes. 2 hours after the explosion, Sterling was arrested at a private airfield trying to flee to Mexico. Her investors, revealed to be connected to organized crime families from Houston, were rounded up in coordinated raids across Texas. Dexter stood in his pasture that evening, watching the sun set behind his father's memorial oak tree. The tree that had started everything was healthy and strong, its roots growing deeper into Kane family soil. Maya stood beside him, her hand in his, both of them understanding that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the cost. "What happens now?" Maya asked. Dexter looked across 50 acres of land that would stay in his family for generations to come. "Now we rebuild, and we make sure this never happens to another family again." The war was over, but the victory belonged to everyone who believed that family land was sacred ground worth defending. 6 months later, Dexter Kane stood where his pasture had been destroyed, watching construction crews install the final section of new fencing. The federal government had paid full restitution for the property damage, plus additional compensation for the trauma and lost income. Sterling's seized assets had funded a victim compensation program for all the families she had targeted. Veronica Steinberg, the woman who had called herself Victoria Sterling, was serving 15 years in federal prison for racketeering, fraud, and domestic terrorism. Her criminal organization had been completely dismantled. The corrupt county officials who had enabled her operation were facing their own trials. Judge Morrison had been removed from the bench and disbarred. Maya Chen's investigative series about rural property theft had won a Pulitzer Prize and led to federal legislation protecting family farms from bureaucratic fraud. She had parlayed her success into a position as senior investigative reporter for the Dallas Morning News, but she had kept her promise to stay close to the story that had changed her life. "The grass is coming in beautifully," Maya said, walking across the restored pasture toward the memorial oak tree. The tree had grown significantly in the month since the crisis, its branches spreading wider and stronger. A small plaque at its base now read, "Thomas Kane. He taught us that some things are worth fighting for." Dexter had used part of the federal compensation to expand his ranching operation, purchasing 2 adjacent properties from neighbors who were ready to retire. The Kane family land now covered nearly 200 acres, ensuring that future generations would have room to grow and thrive. Maya had moved into the ranch house 3 months ago. What had started as a professional alliance during the investigation had developed into something deeper and more lasting. She had never imagined herself as a rancher's wife, but the land had claimed her as surely as it had claimed 3 generations of Kanes before her. "I have news," Maya said, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "The kind of news that means this tree is going to have company soon." Dexter pulled her close, understanding immediately. Their child would grow up on land that his grandfather had bought, that his father had protected, and that Dexter had fought to save. The family legacy would continue, rooted in the same soil that fed the memorial oak. The county had established new protections for rural property owners, requiring public hearings and independent environmental reviews before any emergency injunctions could be issued. Frank Martinez had been elected to the county commission, ensuring that local government would never again be used as a weapon against family farmers. As the sun set over the restored pasture, Dexter and Maya sat beneath the oak tree where his father used to watch the evening sky. The tree that Victoria Sterling had tried to use as justification for theft had become a symbol of resistance against corporate greed. "You know what the best part is?" Dexter said, his arm around Maya as she leaned against his shoulder. "My father always said that when you plant an oak tree, you're planting for your children and grandchildren." He was right. The memorial oak rustled in the evening breeze, its leaves whispering stories of family, resilience, and the unshakable truth that some ground is too sacred to surrender. Dexter had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of remembrance can become the foundation for the biggest victories. 3 generations of Kanes had worked this land, and now a 4th generation was on the way. Victoria Sterling had tried to steal their past, but instead, she had secured their future. The tree stood tall. The land remained free, and the Kane family legacy was stronger than ever. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale of courage and justice in the American West. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.